I will now start the recording. So influencing skills. I think one of the reasons that I'm interested in this subject is that if you look at what's out there at the moment, it's either too salesy, in other words, smile training and how to manipulate people at one end of the scale, and at the other end of the scale, it's a little bit too academic and it's really not applicable. So I thought, well, maybe it might be best to sort of put together a model which I think is quite practical for you as a leader. So I'm hoping that you've had a chance to complete your online profile. I hope you've had a chance to complete that, because this session will make even more sense to you. But it's not too late. If you haven't completed it, you've still got that opportunity to do this. So I guess I'm sort of doing it in a roundabout way then. If you haven't completed it, I'm sort of giving you the debrief before you've completed the diagnostic. But so it's important to try and implement these things. We're all busy, but if you can complete the sort of homework, as I call it, before the session, it makes a big difference. Okay, let's move into the presentation. Here are 4 leaders, and you can probably recognize them. You probably recognize them all. In fact, only one of them's alive still. 3 of them are dead. Some of them, or one of them at least, has been assassinated. Another was threatened to be assassinated. But they're all highly influential leaders. And I want you to have a think about what they might all have in common. Well, obviously they're well known. They're also highly controversial. I think it's fair to say that you will either love or hate each of these people in terms of the image that they've created in your own mind about what sort of leader they are. And so one of the things, obviously, that they've got in common is they're quite divisive, in the sense that you either love what they did or are doing, or you don't. So I'm going to use these 4 people as influencers, because one of the things they've all got in common is the fact that they have been, in their careers, highly influential, to a point where, generational change has occurred and so forth. So, but each of them, interestingly enough, has influenced you and I and others in a way that is consistent with one of the 4 influencing strategies that are in the profile. So you have 4 particular different styles of influences, and I'm going to go through and use this as a theme as we run through our presentation here today. So 4 influences. Now let's just be absolutely clear about what I'm talking about here. You're a leader, and you might think, well, what has influence got to do with me? Well, it's got everything to do with you. And you might be thinking, well, influence sounds like manipulation or underhandedness or cunningness. Nothing could be further from the truth. What I'm really referring to here is the power to make other people agree with your opinions or get them to do what you want willingly and ethically. So in other words, people are doing what you want or getting them to think in a certain way because they want to. I mean, obviously you want to as well, but they have decided that that's the right way to think or act. And so really what I'm talking about is doing something very ethically. And there's nothing underhanded or sneaky about this. It's really about getting people to get on board with what you want them to do, and to do it in a way where they're willing to do it, and to do it in a transparent and open way. So let's be clear about this. So it's very important that we get that clear before we move any further. I think it's very, very important also to make the point that you and I are in the business of influence. Let's not delude ourselves. We are professional influencers. I guess what I'm trying to do now is influence you, And I guess as soon as you finished here, if you've had and you've had your lunch and you're back at work, you're going to be influencing somebody about something, either successfully or unsuccessfully. So just remember that influence occurs three ways in an organisation. Influence occurs upward. In other words, it's about influencing your boss, and that's critically important, and the skills that I'm going to share with you in this webinar are very applicable to influencing upwards. You also need, of course, to influence downwards, and that is the people who report to you. And, you know, you're doing that every day in contact with people. Sometimes you're successful, sometimes you're not. There is another emerging form of influence, and that is what I call sideways influence, and that is the influence that you may have with your colleagues, perhaps at the same level, in different teams, different departments, different regions. And of course, you need their buy-in in order to be successful in what you're doing. So think about influencing in terms of upward, downward, and sideways. So, but the point is, we're all in this business. I think there was a time where you could actually just tell people what to do, and they do it because you happen to have a title that says that you're a manager. But these days, people are not quite as willing to be just told what to do. The power bases of teachers in society are breaking down. Teachers can't keep students in anymore unless there's a very relevant excuse, you know, for lunch or after school. Police officers have an enormous, don't have the same influence they once had. So all of our legitimate power has been eroded away. So what that basically means is that you and I have got to learn a different way of getting people to do what we want them to do, which of course is influence or persuasion. The other thing that's very important about the concept of influence is that there are three critically important variables in any influencing situation. So have a think about this. There's your preferred style and approach. You have a preferred style and approach, and when you completed the profile, what it was attempting to do is to demonstrate to you what your preferred style and approach is when it comes to influencing. We've all got this preferred style and approach, and what happens, as you probably can imagine, is that we probably spend most of our time influencing people in terms of how we like to be influenced. In other words, we tend to influence people with our preferred style and approach. And of course, we've all had cases where we've tried something and it's not worked. And probably the reason it hasn't worked is the second key variable is the other person's style or influence. So the people you're trying to influence have a preferred style of influence as well. And if the way you try to influence them is not the way they want to be influenced, there's a reasonable chance that you're not going to hit the mark. So one of the themes that I want you to try, and this is going to be homework, is to actually vary your influencing style and approach depending on the person that you're influencing. And also the last key variable, which is the context. The context really means the situation that you're in. Now, obviously, in an emergency, and I know we have a lot of people in emergency services in this broadcast, clearly when there is a crisis, your style of influence is very much short, sharp, directive, and to the point. It has to be, because you don't have time on your side. But in another case where you do have time on your side, it's a different form of influence. So think about it that way. You have your personal style, you have the other people that you're trying to influence, they have their own way that they want to be influenced, and you have a situation. Now, if you put all those three things together, there's a good chance, of course, that you can get it right most of the time. We won't get it right all the time, but most of the time. So I guess what this broadcast is trying to do is to demonstrate to you that use a varying amount of style and depending on the situation and the person that you're influencing. and you'll get much, much better results. Now, what you're seeing here in front of you is basically the influencing diagnostic, or the influencing profile. It's a pretty simple model, but as we start to unpack it, you'll see that it's got more and more relevance to what you do. So you can notice that up the top, you've got the push style, and you've got the pull and the push style. And over on the right-hand side, you've got the logical approach and the emotional approach. So they're the ingredients for the model, and then obviously what you've got in the middle is 4 influencing styles. You've got the investigation, the calculation, the motivation, and the collaboration styles and strategies. So let's just understand this a little bit further. So what do I mean by push and pull? Well, the words are kind of implicit, but push style is people who are a little bit more assertive. They like to give clear direction and information. There's a tendency that they'll be a little bit more driving in terms of their approach. Now, if you've got your influencing diagnostic in front of you, you might actually like to have a look at your investigation and motivation scores. So if you had a score in the middle there for investigation and motivation, if you add those two scores up, that will give you a push style score. So over on the top there where it's got push style, there's a little box next to it. Just write in the score there, and that'll give you a push style. So obviously the investigation and motivation styles are push style, and of course I'll explain those a little bit more to you in a moment. And on the other hand, we've got the pull style, and that's a little bit more collaborative, a little bit more enabling. It's a little bit more around involving other people in the process of persuasion. So if you add up your calculation score and your collaboration score and add it up the top there where you've got the pull style, whichever score is higher, push or pull, will give you your first clue as to your style of influence. So obviously if your push style is predominantly higher than your pull style, then that's your natural tendency. Again, if your pull style is higher than your push style, then that's your natural tendency. Is one better than the other? Not necessarily. Again, it depends on the person that you're trying to influence, and it also depends on the situation. All right, so if your scores are fairly even, well, that probably suggests that you can use both styles pretty easily. In other words, you can fluctuate between one or the other. Now, moving over to the logical and emotional approaches, let's have a look at what I mean by that. I suppose, again, this is self-explanatory. Logical is really using facts, figures, evidence, being rational, having a structure, using measurement. And if you have a look on the model there, the investigation and calculation styles or approaches very much are the more logical approach. So again, if you haven't already done so, add up your investigation and calculation scores and put them in the box on the right-hand side next to logical approach. And that'll give you an indicator of whether you, to the extent that you like to use logic when you're influencing people. And below that, what I like to call below the line, we've got the motivation and collaboration strategies. And if you add up your motivation and collaboration scores and add it to your emotional approach score as a total, you will see whether you are more emotional or more logical when you try to influence other people. So emotional is more about tugging at the heartstrings, bringing feelings into play, using values, talking about flexibility and morale and building teams up. Again, which is more effective? Obviously it depends on the situation. But if you have a look at your profile, your score might be higher on one and not the other. And what that suggests is that you could possibly be using that approach too much. So if it's fairly even, you probably can fluctuate between the two. So that's the first kind of concept that I want you to consider. And if you look at it, then obviously the investigation strategy is a push logical approach. If you look at the calculation strategy, it's a pull logical approach. If you look at the motivation strategy, it's a push emotional. And then if you look at the collaboration, it's a pull emotional approach. So that gives you your first indicator as to where you sit in the profile. All right, so let's drill down a bit further and actually try to understand what these 4 words mean a little bit more. Now, the other thing you'll notice, of course, when you completed the profile, and if you haven't, as I said before, you've got an opportunity to do that. You'll notice that there are 4 competencies for each of the 4 each of the 4 influencing strategies. And you will have had a score for each of those on your profile. So I don't want to run through each of those in great detail. There's a book that I've written that goes into those in great detail if you're interested. But basically what I want to say there is that having a glance at your scores on your profile, what you really should be interested in is, and of course, just take a step back for a minute, the 4 scores in each of those competencies add up to the major score in investigation, calculation, motivation and collaboration. So that's how you get your scores. If you haven't already scored that, that's how you do it. But what you're really looking at is your low scores. I really strongly urge you to look at your low scores. And when I say low scores, I'm saying relative to the other scores, because, you know, as long as you've been consistent filling this out, it'll probably be a reasonable indicator of who you are and how you like to influence. Having said that, there's no harm whatsoever for you to give this to one of your team members or 2 and ask them to complete it, and that could be quite interesting to see how they see you, or your boss if you've got good relationships with your boss. But nevertheless, the lower scores relative would suggest that there are areas that you probably don't exercise enough when you're influencing. So what I really want you to take out of this is to actually have a look at the low scores and start to think, how can I use them more in my day-to-day working environment with the people that I lead, the people I work with, as in stakeholders, which is and even my boss. How can I actually inject some of that into what I do? And I'm going to give you a couple of tools to do that during this broadcast. So if you completed all the boxes and you've got numbers in all the boxes, that's great, because what that does is it really gives you a very clear snapshot of your influencing style and approach, and that's exactly what this is about. And, you know, I'd also say to you that your higher scores relative to the other scores means that you do use that regularly. You know, you might use that competency on a regular basis, but just beware, just because you use it on a regular basis doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to be effective. Because as I said before, you have the other person and you have the situation. So therefore, because you're comfortable with it, and that's why the score's high, you're probably using it too much. And therefore, occasionally, you're probably finding that the other person, the glaze goes in their eyes if you're meeting them face to face, and it doesn't seem to be going where you want it to go. The key then is to change tack and use another strategy and another style, and to try plan B, plan C, and so on until you hit the mark. So if you showed me somebody that was outstanding at influencing, and I'm sure if you thought about it, you'd probably know people that are very, very persuasive. If you actually look at why they're persuasive, They're probably persuasive because they use a variety of different approaches and they use them in different contexts and situations. Sometimes it's completely subconscious and other times it's quite deliberate. But that's essentially how they go about persuading and influencing. All right, moving right along. So let's have a look at Al Gore. Al Gore, of course, was Vice President of the United States of America under the Clinton administration, and since he left office, he did have a crack at the presidency in 2000 and missed out by a handful of votes in that very controversial election against George W. Bush. And he then went on to be a climate change crusader, and you might recall him with that Inconvenient Truth video with all the charts and graphs and statistics that were there, where he was trying to convince and persuade people of the need to do something about climate change. Now, investigators like to marshal their facts. They like to use figures. They like to assertively advance their argument. So they're very good at using logic, and there's a tendency for them to be quite structured in their approach. So if you've got a higher score relative to the others, it's likely that that's your approach. You know, you like to use those sorts of approaches. And Al Gore is a classic example of somebody who really loves facts and figures and uses them to his advantage. And so, you know, if you just go and Google Inconvenient Truth and actually have a look at the video, you'll be quite astounded at how incredibly strong Al Gore is as an investigator in his influencing style. And obviously, if you're an investigator, then you're likely to be influenced by other investigators. And so that sort of approach will appeal to you, notwithstanding the subject matter. The use of facts, figures and logic will be very appealing to you. So that's Al Gore. So if you think about, you know, the various professions out there that actually apply this approach, you've got police. Obviously they do an investigation, they mount a case, and away you go. And of course scientists and researchers as well, they spend their life putting together or attempt to put together a watertight thesis, and they use a lot of logic and facts and figures and arguments to make a case. So there's some professions that very much use the investigation style. So when would this be useful to use as a leader? Well, when you've got situations like a workplace incident, such as a safety incident or a bullying or harassment incident in the workplace, and you're obliged to investigate, obviously what you want to do is to get your, you want to be able to do that fairly thoroughly and methodically. So you might interview a number of people, or you might actually go and do a site investigation, and that becomes critically important. And then you might actually write up a report, and on the basis of the rigour of your investigation, you could make some recommendations about what needs to happen. So that's obviously highly suitable. So the inquisitive investigator could be very, very useful in those situations. But let's look at when you wouldn't use it, and that third bullet point there on your screen. When you've got large-scale change in your team or department or whatever, even organisation, if you've got large-scale initiatives where you want every person on board, throwing facts and figures at them is not necessarily going to hit the mark. So you're going to have to try another approach, because they may not understand the direction of where you're going. So they need a little bit more of a broader approach. They need to understand the rationale for why you're doing something, and looking at a logical approach may not be the right way to go. So Margaret Thatcher, who of course is, and if you think about her style of leadership, it's very much a clear calculator. Calculator has a funny connotation to it. It sounds like manipulation. Not necessarily the case. Calculators in this case, what I'm referring to at least, they like to promote the positives of a proposal and highlight the weaknesses of the current position. So essentially people who like to calculate are people who others know exactly where they stand. They know what the key performance indicators are, and they also know where they stand in relation to those key performance indicators. So these people will still use logic, just like the investigators, to advance their cause, but generally what happens is that they will talk about pros and cons. So if you went into a retail outlet, for example, and there was a sign outside saying 40% off laptops, and that lured you into the store, which it would, I guess, and you go into the store and there's another sign saying there, must purchase by the close of business today, that's a classic calculation influencing strategy. So in other words, we're talking about pain and pleasure. The pleasure is a 40% discount on laptops. The pain is I have to make a decision by the close of business today. So retailers are very much use that approach when they're trying to influence other people. So usually they're very good debaters, and people who are good at debaters. So if you're one of those calculators, that'll make a lot of sense to you. So let's look a little bit deeper at that. So people in sales use calculation to their advantage. Financial advisors, in the sense of saying, you know, here's the positives about investing in this particular venture. However, if you don't, there could be some disadvantages as well. Animal trainers, you know, you go to the circus and you'll notice that the animal trainer there will have a whip in one hand and a pocket full of treats in the other, and they'll essentially fluctuate between the whip and the treats in order to get the animal to do what they want them to do, influence them, in other words. And of course teachers use this strategy as well at school, and we can all remember teachers, you know, you're either on the good side or the bad side, but you kind of knew where you were, and teachers use this strategy quite successfully. Now, where it is very, very effective is where you've got a new change in the workplace that will be affecting employees. So fundamentally, it might be a new computer system, and their work methods will be affected significantly. So, you know, it might be some sort of legislation, but like harassment or bullying legislation training, or as I said, a piece of new software. So you've got to talk about the advantages there are for people to actually adopt the new system, and you've also got to talk about the disadvantages in relation to not going down this road. So people need to know there's a little bit of pain in not changing. So this can be highly effective. Where it's not very effective is in situations where the direction is very vague and unclear. So, for example, you have a belief that you could create a new market for a product, but people aren't quite sure what that means. So you've got a bit of explaining to do. So using a bit of pain and pleasure there to try to convince people is not really going to work in those circumstances. So you can see that the calculator still uses logic, but the point is that they use logic more in a subtle way, whereas the investigation throws facts and figures at the person or persons, whereas the calculator will talk about some of the principal positives and some of the negatives. Okay, let's move on. Incidentally, if you've got any questions, please put them into the box there, and I'll go through that. Okay, so sounds like there's a bit of issues with the audio again, so apologies for that. Although there are some people that are having no problem with it. So yeah, the perils of technology. Anyway, let's move on. Now, we're going below the line now, so what what we're now looking at is the two influencing strategies, which are based on emotion rather than logic. So again, look at your scores, look at what you scored in your motivation strategy comparative to the others. And if this is your highest score, then this is the one that you feel most comfortable using. So motivators, and what do they do? Well, there's a tendency, and of course Martin Luther King, I think, was probably the best exemplar of a leader who uses motivation. If you ever have a chance to go online and have a look at the video, I Have a Dream, a wonderful speech, a very moving speech, and one that moved a generation and a nation. And one of the reasons it was so influential was because Martin Luther King used motivation as a strategy in that speech. So you won't notice much logic in there, but you'll notice a lot of emotive language and a lot of metaphors and so forth. So motivators use emotion to influence. So what they do is they often talk about the big picture, and what they do is they link it with a compelling vision of the future. So they'll have a way with words, and they can define a simple and convincing vision. Please don't think you have to be a great orator like Martin Luther King in order to be a good motivator. Use stories, use critical incidents, talk about examples in the workplace. People who are good storytellers are usually very good at motivation because they can paint a picture of a compelling vision of what they want. So, and again, if the score is low compared to the others, then there's some work to do, and start working on building up that strategy. Entrepreneurs are classic motivators. They surround themselves with people who buy into the dream of the entrepreneur. Think Richard Branson, very big picture. Advertising executives obviously think about trying to tug at the heartstrings, and any ad that's on television is really trying to use, probably more than anything else, the motivation strategy to influence you to buy their product or use their service. Public relations agents, artistic directors, they are all in the business of motivating via using a big picture. So the motivation strategy is great when you're developing a new strategic direction and you really want to capture the hearts and minds of people. So absolutely wonderful with a new strategic direction. But where it doesn't work at all is where people are completely unclear of the rationale or the reason for initiative. So if you had to instigate, for example, cost-cutting measures, that would be a situation where you'd have to explain the reason for that before you started to motivate people about how you might work with that. So you've got to, use the right approach in the right situation. Okay, Mother Teresa, a collegial collaborator, and collaborators are brilliant at influencing through emotion as well, but what they do is they persuade people by involving them in the decision-making process. So collaborators are great team builders, and they engage people's hearts and minds, and they build coalitions of support and build teams, and Mother Teresa obviously built great influence with government agencies and coalitions of supporters and donors and so forth to be able to help the homeless on the streets of Calcutta initially and then elsewhere. So very, very good at bringing people together to work together, and that's their style. So if you had a higher score in this area, then you like to take people with you when you're influencing, and you like them to be involved. Of course, the blind spot is if they don't want to be involved, you might find that you're trying to collaborate with them and you're getting nowhere. You need to try a new approach. So a conductor of an orchestra who essentially doesn't have an instrument, basically a baton or nothing, basically conducts an orchestra by engaging the different sections of the orchestra at different points during the ensemble. Funeral directors coordinate a range of different services in order to, create an event which runs smoothly, and so do choreographers. So they spend a lot of time collaborating with people. So in circumstances, think about this, in circumstances where you've got very diverse and strongly held views. So let's say your team has very strong views one way or the other. The best thing that you can do is actually have that out in a conversation. So getting everyone in the room and actually listening to everybody's point of view is a very good approach, because what you're doing is you're surfacing the concerns and you're allowing people to hear the other concerns. Sweeping them under the carpet is not a good idea. Not addressing them is not a good idea, because what it does is it just solidifies the strong opposition that people have to the views of other people. So get it out in the open and have a good conversation about it, and do it in a controlled environment rather than at the water cooler, which is likely to be the place it will occur unless you use collaboration in a room. Now, if people need to know the logic and the rationale behind a decision, they'll want to know that first before they collaborate. So if you're a collaborator, don't dive straight into collaboration first until you give people the facts, the logic, and the rationale for why something has to happen the way it has to happen. And if you do it properly, then you can start collaborating about how it might work for you in the future. Okay, moving right along. I'm just going to check to see if we've got any questions as such. No, so please type them in if you have. Sorry, I do have a question here. Yeah. If you're giving a presentation, which of the 4 styles is best? Well, thanks for the question. If you're giving a presentation to a group of people that you don't know, and in fact the larger the group, the more you need to use all 4 styles. So, for example, you might start your presentation by giving the facts and the figures. So let's say you're trying to persuade a group of people, which is normally what a presentation is. You give people the facts and figures. Now, by doing that, what you're doing is you're giving people, you're indicating that you have a command of the current situation. The people in the audience who are investigators, and there's inevitably going to be some, will certainly be persuaded because you're on the same wavelength. You might then start to talk about the big picture. So we go down to motivation on the profile, and you might talk about how this proposal links with the strategic direction of the organisation. So how it is consistent with the actual values and direction of the company or the organisation. You then might actually ask for questions and comments from your audience. So you're engaging the audience in your presentation. So you're now using collaboration, which we're obviously referring to now. And finally, you might have one slide in your presentation which shows the positives, in other words, the advantages of change. So you might have 3 or 4 key points about the benefits of the change you're proposing, and 3 or 4 key points on the drawbacks of not changing. In other words, if we don't move in this direction, here are some of the consequences. So it'll be a pretty compelling presentation. I've got my facts, I'm explaining the big picture, I am actually I'm asking people for their input, and I'm also showing people the pros and the cons of the situation. That's going to be influential. Unfortunately, a lot of us will just simply use one of those 4 styles and hope like anything that it works. So try all 4. So thanks for the question. When you're giving a presentation, it's great to use all 4 because you can actually plan out how you do that. Same with reports as well. When you're giving a report, same situation. Use all 4 styles. Okay, now what I want to do now is just talk about some of the tools that you might use. In my book, I've got 64 different tools, practical tools you can use to actually improve your capacity to use the 4 strategies that I've referred to. but here's a snapshot of some. So when you're using investigation, you can use what we call third-party endorsements. So if another organisation that you know of, say in another jurisdiction or another company, they're using another approach, what you can do is you can quote somebody from that organisation, or even get that expert in, if it's practical, to actually use their knowledge to talk to your team about what they experienced. That can be enormously powerful. Of course, if you pick up any book and you turn to the back cover, that's what they do. They have, testimonials on there from reputable people, and that helps, I guess, the decision to buy the book. Use structured interviews. So if you go out and interview people, try and ask exactly the same questions of the various people, so it adds some credibility to your data when you collect it. So structured interviews, of course, we use that when we're recruiting people, and so that's a good example of using investigation strategy. Conducting a survey, any surveys, if it's done properly, is an influencing strategy in terms of the recommendations that come out of it, but it's basically founded on the investigation strategy. And processing mapping, as you can see on the screen, there's a process map, a very simple one. You can use a process map to map out a particular process in your business or organisation and start to look at some of the pinch points and start to talk to your team about how you might remedy some of the problems that might be in the process. So there's some strategies you can use to improve your influencing strategy. So if you're low on that, use any of those four, will help you. Okay, what about calculation? So calculation, force field analysis, Kurt Lewin's brilliant concept. You draw the line down the centre of a page, and on one side you have driving forces, on the other side you have restraining forces. So you can do this in a group of people. So if you've got your team together and you brainstormed about some of the driving forces for the change that you're implementing and some of the restraining forces that were going to prevent the change from occurring, and got your team involved, guess what? You're using two different strategies at the same time. You're using calculation and you're using collaboration. So it's likely to be extremely powerful, particularly when you can use a couple of different strategies. Any cost-benefit analysis is clearly going to be using calculation, so using facts and figures. An after-action review, which is essentially looking at an incident or project that's completed and then asking three key questions. What went well, what didn't go well, and what will we do differently as a result of what we've learnt? They can be really powerful calculation strategies at the end of a project for learning. So that can be really useful. Right, so those three I'd highly recommend, and if you're low on calculation, use those as a means of just improving your capacity to persuade. So motivation strategies, I think there's four here that you can use that I think are very powerful. One's a team values charter. It's based on 4 questions. Question 1, and you say this to the team, you actually ask them to write it down. If there was one value that was important working in this team, what would it be? Question 2, define what that value is. Question 3, why is that value important to you? Question 4, what behaviours would demonstrate that value? Now, if you got everyone in your team to complete that exercise and then asked everyone in the team to read out their value and what their definition of that value is, why it was important to them, and what behaviours would demonstrate that, you'll find that that's extremely powerful because everyone's bought into their own values, and you can create a team values charter. So that's a good way of motivating people towards a particular direction. The GROW model, I'll have an opportunity later in the series to talk to you a bit more in detail about that, but GROW stands for goal, reality, options, and where to from here. So somebody comes to you with an issue, you say, tell me, what are you aiming to achieve? That's your first question. 2, what's stopping you, which is the reality. O is what options do you think might work for you? You'll notice it's plural, so we're looking for more than one option. And W is what do you need to do next, or where to from here. Very powerful process. And you'll find people will walk out of your space or office a lot more with a spring in their step, feeling a lot more comfortable about what they need to do, because you've helped them help themselves. Storytelling, if you're a natural storyteller, use stories, and I mean stories that have got some sort of a message in them. Even stories where you've made a mistake, because humility is a great thing as a leader. So if there's a story where you really did mess up, share it. And basically the message is, don't do what I do, what I did. And then, of course, I always think it's wonderful to start a meeting with a good news story or wins for the week, whatever you want to call it. Why not just implement that? Start with yourself, go around the table, win for the week. And after the first time everyone looks at you in a very strange way, because we tend to talk about problem of the week rather than win for the week. But if you do that, it gets everyone on the right foot and we're moving in the right direction. Okay, some collaboration tools that might be useful for you. And remember, this is also a motivational strategy as well. So here's some tools. Stephen Covey, the late Stephen Covey, in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, great read if you haven't read it, by the way. One of the chapters there talks about the end in mind. So what Covey's basically saying is start with the goal. So if you're going to collaborate with your group, in other words, use the group for a group discussion, why not set a goal? Why not say at the beginning of the session, guys, what we're attempting to do here is blah, blah, blah. This is what I want at the end of this session. And then you let it flow and keep reminding people that at the end of this session, I'm expecting us to come up with a solution on X. And then you just let people talk it through. So it's good to, in collaboration, it's good to give people a target. So again, we're combining two strategies here, motivation and collaboration. Here's the end result, and let's talk about it. Give effective feedback. Well, we had a whole unit on this. Unit 1 was all about that, and I as I said before, we got some great feedback. Giving people feedback is a collaborative tool because you're actually expecting it to be two-way. So ask people how they think they went. Refer back to the notes that you have about Unit 1. Use a problem-solving approach. Actually use, the 7-step problem-solving approach, which is a very rational approach, and work your way through that problem-solving approach with one or more people to get better results. Paraphrasing and active listening. I know people like me, keep banging on about this, but at the end of the day, it's one of the most valuable tools that you could possibly imagine, is to be able to sum up in your own words what someone has just told you is enormously powerful as an influencing strategy, because it does a number of things. One is it lets the person know that you've heard them and understood them. Secondly, if you haven't understood them and heard them the correct way, they are in a position to correct you. And thirdly, you can move the conversation on, because you don't have to listen to any more. You can say, no, I know, I've got it now, I understand exactly what you mean. So that's the process of active listening. So practice those skills, and if you're low on collaboration in your score, on your profile, there's some skills and things that you can use to practice. All right, that brings us pretty much to the end, and again, I think if you've got questions, here we go. We've got a couple of questions coming through, and I'm more than happy to answer those. Okay. How does one keep positive while trying to communicate or influence negative or cynical staff on a constant basis? Look, I think we've probably all come across people who are negative, and I call them professional resistors. If you gave them free beer tomorrow, they'd complain it wasn't cold. Those sorts of people. Every organisation has got some of them. Sounds like you've got some of them, and Sarah, and I think, look, to me, this is not about influence. I think it's about sitting down with a person and having a conversation with them and finding some critical incidents and explaining to them that you're concerned that, and be careful with this, because obviously if you say to them you're always negative, then, that's labelling the person. You might actually be true. They might always be negative, but it's not going to help you to say that. So say the last, and this is probably getting back to Unit 1, say to them, look, you said 3 things in the team meeting before, and all of them were critical without having any solution. And I'm really concerned about that, because what I'm trying to do is build up some positivity in the team. So, confront the person about it and talk to them, because quite frankly, if you're trying really hard, Sarah, which you probably are, to building a good team situation, and then this person is dragging everyone down, that's a lead weight in the saddle. So you've got to sit down with that person and explain to them that that is actually not on. You have every right to do that. And if they can't say something positive, challenge them to shut up and say nothing, and it's a work in progress. You might have to set another meeting and another meeting and another meeting, but the more you explain to them the fact that you need them to be on the team and so forth, the more they understand that it's important to you. So I'm afraid there's no easy answer. It's just hard yards, but you've got to actually confront them about that negative attitude, because if you don't, nothing will change. And of course the other thing is not to take it personally. It's probably not you, it's just them, and nobody's probably pulled them up in their whole career, and they just think that that's the way they go, and probably they'll go home tonight and they'll be exactly the same at home. So you just got to say to them that we need to change. So use some of the skills you've learned today, but the bottom line is it's really a conversation, a difficult conversation, but one nevertheless that you really need to have with that person. And you know what? You will feel much, much better when you have that conversation, regardless of how it goes. You know why? Because you're being true to yourself. You know you need to do this, and you just do it, and you just get on with it. So by all means, have a crack at it and send me an email. Let me know how you get on, because it's needed, and just do it. But use critical incidents. So use investigation to collect your evidence. Talk about the big picture, which is the motivation, which is, I'm trying to create a positive team environment here, and what you're doing or what you did in that meeting is inconsistent with that. Talk about, get them involved and say, can you see what I'm on about? Do you understand what I mean by this? Are you on board with this? So get some feedback from them and explain to them that it will be very helpful on the one hand, but on the other hand, you and I are going to continue to have these conversations if it doesn't change, because frankly it needs to change. So I'm using calculation as well. So use all 4 in the conversation, but at the end of the day the vehicle is a difficult conversation nevertheless. So give it a crack, but be reassured, law of averages, anyone that's led a sizable group will always have somebody that's a professional resistor. That's unfortunately the case. Anyway, getting back to homework, your homework, if you haven't already done it, is to complete the profile. Now, if you've completed the profile, I really want you to go out, start this afternoon, and start using and implementing some of these tools, and just try them, and have some courage. Use the tools that you feel least comfortable with, because you'll be amazed at how it will broaden your scope to influence, and you'll get great results, and you'll be quite astounded at how much influence or new influence you'll have. But look, I should be able to walk up to any of you and say, and I'm obviously not going to do this, so I walk up and I say, right, Fred or Mary has done this influencing profile. and you know that there's investigation, calculation, collaboration and motivation as 4 influencing strategies, can you tell me which one of those Mary or Fred favours? Do you know what response you should get? The response you should get is, I don't know. I don't know because Fred and Mary uses all 4. I see them being quite flexible. What you don't want is for them to come back to you and say, or to me and say, oh no, Fred is an investigator, or Mary is a calculator, or Fred is a motivator, or Mary is a collaborator. Because if you do that, then you've been typecast. And in other words, what's happening is you're using one of the 4 strategies too often, and it's likely that you've alienated a section of your team because you are not using a persuasive style and approach that's applicable to them. So have some fun with it. Try some things out. That's the homework. And keep the feedback going, of course, but that's the homework. So just a couple of things before I finish up. Just a quick sales pitch. I won't go overboard with this, but if you're interested in my book, which has, as I said, 64 different strategies, there it is. I'm happy to give you a 30% discount on the basis of you being in the program. So you just send me an email and I'll give you a code. You can go online, I'll sign it for you and send it out. So there's a possibility for you. And let's just get back to big picture. So in Module 1 or Unit 1, we looked at the ingredients of feedback, and I know many of you are having the courage to try to do more of that. Well done. It's nice to hear. Please send me your emails. This is I want, you know, as far as I'm concerned, this is a difficult medium because I can't see you, of course. You can see me at glimpses, but not all the time. But I can hear or I can read what you've, so send me some material. Send me some, tell me how things are going. We've obviously covered, personal influence today. When we get back together again on September 23, optimising team performance. So what we'll do there is we'll look at how we can get the best out of our team. Then we'll continue and look at some motivational strategies around how we can actually improve the productivity of the people we lead. You'll get a diagnostic between sessions 4 and 5, which will be a bit of a personality profile, which will set us up nicely for Module 5, which will be on understanding people and their personalities. And Module 6, we finish up with how to run an effective meeting. So I guess in conclusion, can I say thank you again for your involvement. Complete the profile, go in and have some courage, have a go at trying different influencing styles. Tell me how you go, and I'll be more than happy. So thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your time and the opportunity of working with you. Thanks, guys. All the best.